Hello, everybody. You're very welcome today. My name is Nadine, and I am the Academic Director in ATC Language Schools here in rainy Ireland today. I'd like to introduce you today to my colleague Joanne Mitten. Joanne has worked with ATC since 2009. She's worked as a teacher trainer, a materials writer, a course developer. She's our other academic director. She works in human resources and also in quality assurance. So as you can see, Joanne has a very wide range of experience across the industry. So today, Joanne is going to talk to us about exploring language and culture through myth and legends. So we have a very rich heritage of storytelling of myths and legends here in Ireland. And we first hear these stories, these legends, when we are very, very young, and they are very much embedded in our culture. But of course, many cultures across the world have deep mythological roots woven into their history and their literature. And these stories of myths and legends are really compelling stories for all age groups, for young and old learners alike. So today, Joanne is going to deliver a really interesting session on using myths and legends in the classroom to help us work with our learners to access these stories and understand the links between language and culture. So it's a very practical session today. She's going to share lots of great tips and ideas with you. So before we get started, I'd just like to remind you that if you have any questions for Joanne, please wait until the end of the session, and then you can pop your questions into the Q&A box, and Joanne will answer them for you when she has finished her presentation. Okay, so I think let's get started. I'll hand you over to Joanne now.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Thank you to everyone for coming along today. It's great to see so many different people and different nationalities with us. So as Nadine said, today I'm going to talk about exploring language and culture through myths and legends. Now, before I start, I just want to say that this area is, huge. There are so many things that we could talk about in this area, whether it's etymology or how language has developed through our oral storytelling and how it's affected the language and the idiomatic phrases that we use. There's a huge amount to this topic. So today's session really is just an introduction. And at the end of the session, I will show you some links and some contact details if you're interested in delving a little deeper into this topic. In the summer, we're running various teacher training courses, and this is actually one of them. So today you're getting an overview and an introduction with some practical tips, but it's actually an area that you could study for weeks and months. There's so much involved in it. So today, my aim is to help you guys understand how stories can act as a gateway to language and a gateway into culture, and to give you practical tips on how you can use stories such as myths and legends in your own lessons, and how you can structure your lessons to really get the most out of these stories. So first of all, I'd like you to name some of the myths and legends from your own country or culture. So I have an example here. One of the pictures we see Romulus and Remus, and this is a Roman myth about two brothers, and the myth develops into the foundation of Rome, how Rome was founded. And we also have Aesop's fables, and the illustration that you see here is the fable of the elephant and the lion. And these are really focused on lessons and morals and teaching us about how to be human. So could you tell me in the chat box, do you have any myths or legends from your country? In Ireland, we have a really rich history of myths and legends. And these are stories that were written 800 to 1000 years ago. We've been learning them since we were children. And I will discuss some of those stories today. So we have stories such as the Children of Lear, Tiernanog, Cuchulainn, and there's a huge background to these stories. And what's really interesting about these stories is the fact that they're all linked together. There's usually family trees and family history within those stories, and you can see the links between the families if you really delve into the mythology of Ireland. So don't worry if you can't think of any of your own myths and legends. We will continue to discuss stories and their impact throughout the next 40 minutes, and I'm sure some of your own stories will come to you. Oh, and I have something in the chat box. Let's see. I hope I am pronouncing this correctly. Sachi Kurupira, he has hair of fire and his feet are backwards. He protects the woods. And Yara, a mermaid. Okay, they sound amazing. They sound like exactly the types of characters that would really get students' imagination going. Fantastic, Mariana. Thank you for putting that into the chat. And now I'm going to ask you another question. Why are our myths and legends important? Why do we tell stories? Why do we keep this tradition of mythology and legends from our country from hundreds and thousands of years ago? Why are they important? Could you tell me in the chat box why these things are important? So, Maria says that in Romania, their legends aren't as beautiful and mysterious as in Ireland. But I don't know. You never know. I mean, I think every country has some really great hidden stories. And could you guys tell me in the chat box, why do we tell stories? We mentioned Aesop's fables a little bit earlier. Those stories were told to teach us life lessons or to teach us some morals. What other reasons do we tell stories? Fantastic. So Mariana says, we desire to keep some traditions alive. And that's absolutely true. We use stories to pass down traditions. And these could be skills such as fishing, diving, weaving, or it could be got to do with music, poetry, storytelling. Maria says, our stories have heroes, models, examples of brave human beings. So we often use these brave heroes as archetypes or the type of people that we hope our children will aspire to be. Fantastic. Sonia has suggested that we use these stories, these myths and legends, to exercise our fears. And that's absolutely true. And when you look at the myths and legends of Ireland, a lot of it is the stuff of horror movies and nightmares. It's really frightening stuff and it can get quite dark. So it's definitely that sort of idea of looking to the dark side and thinking of the most dangerous or scary thing that could happen. Fantastic. So let's have a look at some other reasons why we tell stories and we pass these legends down throughout generations. So in the pictures here, I've displayed some pictures of Irish storytelling. The painting near the bottom of the screen is a painting of the Shanachie. A Shanachie is an Irish storyteller, and traditionally they would journey from town to town, particularly in rural Ireland, and they would entertain big houses or communities. They would tell stories of very old myths and legends. They'd also sing songs or recite poetry and tell other types of stories. And there were many reasons behind this. And the other picture that you see there is from more recent times. It's a 1960s picture of a storyteller in rural Ireland. So the tradition of storytelling in Ireland is extremely strong. So first and foremost, we tell these stories as entertainment around the campfire to scare each other, to make each other laugh, and particularly before we had technology like TV, radio, it was the real source of entertainment for people. But as some of you mentioned in the chat box, these stories also hold a sense of history and culture for the country that they originate from. So, for example, in Ireland, much of our culture comes from these myths and legends that we all know so well from childhood. And we also talked about the fact that we pass down our traditions through stories, and many communities around the world still do this today. They pass down skills, knowledge, survival techniques through storytelling, through the oral tradition. Stories, not just myths and legends, but often fairy tales and other types of stories, were written to maintain the status quo, so to uphold a certain fabric in society, or to keep people on the straight and narrow. And this often linked to morals and life lessons, so using stories to show us how we should live our life, how we should interact with each other, and how we should learn from mistakes. Stories also give us a great insight into human nature, and we'll see when we look at some of the very old stories and myths and legends from Ireland, you'll see that a lot of the themes and ideas are very relevant and very current to modern Ireland. Stories tell us about the society of the time, but they also can tell us a lot about our current society. And an example of this is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So, you know, when we read this novel, and when we read much of Charles Dickens' work, we see that he was making a social commentary on the state of England at the time, and how people were living, how the poor tried to survive, the damage that it does when people don't share their wealth, or when there's a huge inequality between rich and poor. So often these types of stories were very entertaining and read widely, but they had a very specific social commentary, and it was very clear what the thoughts of the author were. And many times stories were a comment on gender, and they were either written to uphold the status quo, as in, women, you should understand your place in society, this is how you behave, this is how you keep your reputation, or they were sometimes subverted. So fairy tales were often written to uphold the status quo for women in society. However, Gothic novels and horror novels were often written to subvert that status quo, and to show female spirits wreaking havoc on the patriarchal society that kept them captive or kept them down when they were alive. So there are all these motives behind why people write and tell stories. But we're going to look at some Irish mythology today, and hopefully by the end of the session, you will have a good idea of how to create some lessons, either around mythology from your own country or from other cultures that you find interesting. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tiernanog. And Tiernanog is one of the first mythological stories that we learn as children in Ireland. Tiernanog is Irish, or Gaelic, for the land of the young. And in the picture here, we see Niamh, who is the daughter of the king of the land of the young. And she's on a beautiful white horse. Her hair is the colour of the sun. She is ethereal. She has a glow around her. She's clearly not from this world. And she appears in Ireland, and appears in front of Oisín and his father, Fionn McCool. So Oisín is the younger man here, but both Oisín and his father were fierce warriors in Ireland. And in fact, predating this myth, there are many myths about their lives as warriors, and of Fionn McCool and his life becoming a warrior and gaining the knowledge of the world. So Niamh arrives in Ireland. She falls in love with Oisín and he instantly falls in love with her. And she tempts him away from his homeland onto her horse and away to the land of eternal youth, or the land of the young. And they live an amazing life there. Time goes by very quickly. They're extremely happy. But then Oisín starts to feel loneliness and feel sorrow for the family that he left behind in Ireland. What he doesn't realize is that 300 years have passed, but for him, because he's in the land of the young, it only feels like a few years. Niamh tells him, you can go home and see your family, but you need to be very careful, stay on the horse and don't touch the ground. But unfortunately, he tries to help somebody as he's traveling through Ireland. He falls off his horse, and as soon as he touches the land, he withers into a 300-year-old man and dies. And so this story has many themes that actually are very relevant to Irish people today and the way Irish people view their homeland and view family life. So a big theme of this myth is the idea of loyalty, being loyal to your family, being loyal to your loved one and the person that you decide to spend your life with. And also this idea of leaving your homeland. And you may know that the Irish are well known for traveling the world. There are more people with Irish heritage living outside Ireland than there are living inside Ireland. We are a country that emigrated for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we still do. And there's that connection with home, or that pining for our homeland. And that's something that comes up throughout a lot of our literature. There's the idea of connection to family and the fear of leaving family behind, the loneliness that comes with leaving your homeland, even if it's for something better or for future prospects. And then this idea of the transience of time, and that time can go extremely quickly, and we can lose connections with people from home and our family, and the importance of keeping those connections. There's that notion of regret, leaving something too late. And then the idea of temptation and being tempted away from family or home, and trying to look at the balance. Is it worth being tempted away if you're going to lose your connections to home? So that's an example of one of our myths in Ireland that everybody knows really well and has very strong connections with themes that Irish people would recognize today. But why are these stories so compelling? Why do we continue to tell stories and use stories with children? I'm going to refer now to Jeremy Bruner, who is an educational psychologist who did most of his research and study in the 1960s. And I really love this quote from Bruner. We are storytelling creatures, and as children, we acquire language to tell those stories that we have inside us. So as humans, it's really natural for us to tell stories and to engage with stories. It's just something that's built into us. It's just a part of us. So therefore, why not use this idea of stories to develop language and help students really explore their second language? And just to link onto this, a little bit of the background of educational psychology that kind of underpins a lot of what we do in ATC. We're very, very keen in active learning and students taking an active role in their learning. Students saying and doing, so creating things, talking things through, communicating, rather than the teacher speaking from the front. And when we're developing our junior courses, this is what we try to strive for. This is the sort of the baseline for everything we do, particularly with our young learners and our teenage learners. And I suppose what I'm getting at there is, what better way to encourage imagination, creativity, active learning, a real immersion in the language, than to use these incredible stories that are linked to our history and linked to our culture. So let's think back to childhood and think back to how we acquire language as as children. So most of us acquire our first language in the same way. Now, there are going to be children that have difficulties with speech and communication and acquiring language. But if we're looking at generally how children acquire language, these are usually the ways that it happens. So children are immersed in their world and the language is all around them. There's constant communication and constant interaction from family, peers, and within their classroom. The reading of bedtime stories has been shown to be a huge benefit to children, expanding their vocabulary, engaging in the world around them, and producing language sometimes a little bit more quickly than if they didn't have bedtime stories. And then while they're reading, or the parent is reading bedtime stories to children, they can often identify objects, they can recognize objects and say the word, and any sort of play that comes out of stories is also linked to naming objects and recognizing objects. We also encourage students to link pictures to words. We get them to point to pictures and say what they see. We get them to play with sounds. So for children who are just picking up their first language, we see in their children's books, there's lots of repetition of sounds and there's lots of fun with sounds in children's books. It's often great to get students to act stories out, or when they know a story to maybe play it or interact with you with the topic around the story. So acting stories out or playing is also another way that they start to acquire language. And of course, because the student is learning the first language usually in the environment of the first language, they're completely immersed in that language and they have context everywhere for the language. And then we have loads of repetition and recycling, and of course, positive reinforcement. So anytime a child utters a word, a new word, or they start to pronounce a word a little more clearly, the adults around them will give them big claps, lots of smiles, lots of encouragement. And this encourages the children to keep going and to keep trying to communicate. And then if we look at language learning and learning a second language, we're going to see lots of comparisons between how we learned our first language as children and how we learn a second language as young learners, teenagers, or even adults. So in a really great language classroom, we're going to be doing these things. And I know that everybody in this session is well aware of how to keep a great language classroom dynamic going. So we know that when you're teaching a language, you need to have a really strong context for the language. We always get our students to identify and label. We get them to link pictures to words. We're always using visuals. Students listen to stories. They often read texts. There's a huge opportunity there for introducing language in a nice contextual way through stories. We get students to play with sounds through pronunciation. We have a huge amount of repetition and recycling. We don't just learn something once and move on. We repeat it. We get them to use it in different contexts. We are all very positive when it comes to our students, praising them and letting them know when they've got something right or they're on the right track. And more these days, we are making cultural links within the classroom, and we're making lots of cross-curricular links. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. We often get our students to act stories out or to role play or to engage in dialogues. So you can see here that what we do in a really great classroom is very similar to what we do when naturally when we're acquiring our first language. And what better way to continue this acquiring of a second language than to bring in stories, because they open up all these possibilities for creating context, using visuals, and then later on, when the student understands the story, the post-story activities are just fantastic, the things that we can do with them. And the best thing about stories is they bring up all these opportunities for communication and interaction. So we're going to look at that in a moment. So stories as a gateway to language. I mean, why are stories so good for opening up language to us, particularly a second language? Well, first of all, they're really engaging, and a story will engage most learners, whether they're young learners, teenagers, or adult learners. A story is going to draw them in because we are all storytellers at heart. Stories give the perfect context for the new language that you want students to encounter. They have a whole world that they can imagine. You can use visuals. They can see the characters. They can describe the characters. They know the time of day. They know the season. It just gives an entire context that then they can pull the language out of. They allow for really imaginative pre- and post-story tasks, which I'm going to talk about today. And they lead to play, creativity, and all these different types of projects that you can build into your lessons. You could use one story to structure an entire language course for a week, 4 weeks, a term. There's a huge amount of potential when you're using myths and legends and pulling apart the language within them. They also bridge a gap between oral and written communication. So sometimes students are quite good at reading and they're quite good at writing in a controlled way. But then if they get this habit of retelling a story or acting out a story, it can be really beneficial for their spoken production. And finally, stories open up all these opportunities for talking about emotion, feelings, cause and effect, society, how behaviors affect us. So it's this idea of educating the whole child rather than teaching subjects that are not linked to each other. Everything is interlinked, and everything can help the child understand the world around them and help teenagers understand the emotions that they're facing day to day. So the picture that you see here, this is Fionn McCool, who you might remember is the father of Oisin, who goes to Tiernanog. But this is Fionn when he was a boy, and he was fishing for the salmon of knowledge for his master. And the salmon of knowledge held all the knowledge of the world. Fionn was told to cook the salmon of knowledge, but not to eat it. However, a blister formed on the back of the fish. He touched the blister, burnt his hand, and put his thumb in his mouth. Therefore, he was the first person to taste the salmon of knowledge. He acquired all the knowledge of the world, and he became this great leader of a warrior tribe, and he had Oisin, his son. So as you can see, there's a whole background, there's a whole family tree to the mythology of Ireland. It's really, really interesting. So we're going to look at how we can scaffold and guide our students through a story-based lesson or a series of story-based lessons. But today we're just going to look at pre-story tasks and post-story or communication tasks. So on this screen, you will see shots from Elt Connect. Elt Connect is ATC Ireland's blog, and it's run by Aoife McLaughlin. She creates the majority of the content and runs the blog herself. And she has a whole section dedicated to Irish culture. And what you're going to see in this session is excerpts from the blog, from her lessons based around Irish culture. So Aoife follows this idea of pre-story tasks and how do we engage our students in the story, sometimes quite complicated stories, before they see the text. So there's a huge amount of visuals being used, an encouragement to read the title and try and decipher what the title tells us about the story or what the subheading might tell us about the story. And then this use of keywords. So providing the students with a box of keywords from the story, like king, wife, castle, children, jealous, magic, and getting the students to talk about what they think the story might be about. So they're making predictions. They might even make a story themselves, a very short story based on those keywords, or just sentences. And in that way, you're also pre-teaching the difficult language to the students, but you're doing that really important thing that we know we should do in language learning, is setting context. So giving the students a really strong context. And then when you're telling the story, or when the students are reading the story, if it's very young learners, you may need to perform the story a little bit using puppets or using gestures. If the students are reading the story, they may want to do it in a jigsaw activity where they read parts of it and put it together, or they may do it in an information gap activity. Whatever way you get the students to read the story and understand the story, what we find in ATC is really helpful is what you do with that information after the story. So that takes us to communication tasks or post-story tasks. And we find these tasks are really, really helpful for students to get their head around the language, but also to start using the language more naturally and in a freer way. So these are some examples for primary school students, or any students under the age of 11. First of all, you get them to repeat their favorite line from the story. So they can read the story again, choose a favorite line, but then get them to have fun with it, get them to say the line. And they should try and say the line in different emotions: excited, angry, sad, frightened. And we find that when we give students this opportunity to really let go and pretend or act, they have lots of fun with pronunciation. Their inhibitions lift a little bit, and they're more inclined to really enunciate and pronounce the sentence in really interesting ways. Another thing you could have your students do is draw the objects and characters from the story on cards, and have them structure the story through the pictures, or move the pictures around to try and retell the story again. They might tell it to their friend, or they might be able to tell it to you, their teacher. And you could even ask them to restructure it the way they would like to tell it. Would they like to change the ending? Would they like to change a sequence in the middle? How would they change the story if they were doing it, if they were writing it themselves? You could also have them talk about what happens next in the story. So, for example, if we go back to Oisin, who has come back to Ireland, he fell onto the ground and now he's an old 300-year-old man and he's about to die. That's where our story ends. But what do you think happens next? What's the next part of that story? Maybe Niamh comes back for him, or a local person finds him and finds out what happened. So there are loads of opportunities there to get students' imagination working. Again, they can act out the story, and they can start writing their own mythology. So you could get them to create a magic object, or create a character who has supernatural powers, and they tell about that character or object to their partner and maybe develop that into their own story. Then if you have secondary school students, maybe middle school or high school students, you could get them to think about all their songs, or look at the songs in their phone and choose a song that matches the theme of the myth that they just read, or the legend that they just read. Or you could get them to think deeply about the characters. What type of characters are they? How are they acting in the story? How do they treat other people? And what motivates them? So by getting them to think about the characters in that way, they can then start to use this information for more creative activities. For example, tell the students that they are now adapting the myth into a movie, and they need to decide where will it be set. What genre will it be? Is it horror? Is it romance? Is it thriller? What do you want what do you want the audience to get from this movie? And which actors are you going to cast in each role, and why? Why did you choose those actors? How will you change the story, and who is your audience? Is it for children, teenagers, or adults? What way are you going to create the story? And moving on from that, students can then storyboard or write a script, and they can even use their phones to make a short film of their movie once it's done. So as you can see, you're using a story to access the language and maybe learn about narrative tenses or adjectives or any other language point that you want students to focus on that day. But then you're taking the theme and the contents and all the imagination of that story, and you're building it into a really great project that could last a week, 2 weeks, or even a full term. So there's just so much opportunity for development when you're using these types of materials. And then, of course, the link to culture. We always want our students to be aware of their own culture, but also to be aware of other people's cultures. So if they've studied a myth or a legend or something based in the history of their own country, we can ask them, what does that tell us about the society of the time? Does it tell us anything about society now? What sort of lessons is the myth trying to teach us? And are these lessons relevant? So now that they understand the characters and they understand the story, they can start to think even more philosophically about what they've just learned. And again, there's no end to the types of creativity that you can tap into when you're using myths and legends. So you could get your students to write a letter from one character to another character. So here on the screen, this is a screenshot from Elt Connect. And it's a letter that the students write after they read a story about the children of Lear. And it's King Lear writing a letter to his wife, Aoife, who didn't treat the children very well. They could modernize the story. So they take a story, a myth from 800 years ago, and place it in the present day. And they decide, how are they going to modernize it? Are they still going to use magic? Or instead of magic, maybe they'll use technology. They could even write a dialogue. So if there's a part of the story that's unclear, they could decide to write a dialogue between two characters to explain that part of the story. We've had students do things like hold a trial. So hold a trial of the main character or the main villain. They can write an entire script for this and they can film it. They use different aspects of the story that they've learned, use evidence from the story, use actual lines from the story. Or you could get them to film a news report. So a modern day news report reporting on this mythological event that's happening here and now, and maybe they could interview people who are passing by, people on the street. So there's a huge amount that you can do, and this is what we're really interested in ATC. It's all the communicative stuff that we can do post-text. And earlier I mentioned the cross-subject links. And you'll find that when you look at the stories from your own culture, or when you look at mythology from around the world, there's always aspects of music, science, inventions, literature. Literature and art often reflect these old mythologies and legends. So there's a real opportunity there to make cross-curricular links in your classroom. An example of that is with sport. Here you see a picture of Cuchulainn, And Cuchulainn was a young boy. He was born Setanta, that was his name. And he was invited to a feast when he was only 7. He turned up at the house of Cullen and he was attacked by Cullen's hound. But Setanta was an amazing sports person. He had superhuman strength. He was incredibly fast, and he was a superstar in hurling. So you see here, this is a hurl, and that's the ball, the schlitter. And he hit the ball into the hound's mouth and killed him. And he felt very bad about that. So he told Cullen that he would take the place of the hound and he would protect Cullen. So his name changed from Setanta to Cuchulainn. And this means the Hound of Cullen. And this story is 800 years old, yet we have hurling as one of our most popular sports in Ireland today. And in one of our Irish culture lessons for young learners and teenagers, we look at hurling and Gaelic, and we look at the rules and the fact that it's such an ancient sport, and a lot of it hasn't changed at all, apart from the fact that it might be a little bit safer now. But you can see that there are links, particularly in Irish culture, between sport, landscape, music, and it's great to make those links because it's very helpful for students when you make those links and show that subjects don't just stand alone. There's lots of crossover. And you can probably tell by now that I am a huge fan of stories in the classroom, and particularly those post-story tasks that help students really get their teeth into the language and really use their creativity to communicate and interact. So I would say using myths and legends in the classroom not only opens the gateway into language, but it helps our students understand what it means to be human, to connect with each other, the importance of our heritage and our history. It also helps students develop skills such as communication, storytelling, problem solving, and they can also look at issues in society and issues in the natural world. So they're crossing over, they're making lots of links, and that's really what we want students to do. And so I highly recommend that if you haven't done it already, it's a great idea to take a myth or a legend or a really well-known story from your culture and create a lesson and see what you can get from it and see what the students get from it. And if you want to use any of the Irish culture lessons that Aoife has created on Elt Connect, I will give you the link at the end of this session. They're really great lessons if your students are interested in Ireland or they just want to learn a really nice story. So here we have some further reading and some links that you might find useful. You'll see the second link there, eltconnect.com/Irish themed lessons. This is where you'll find lots of lessons that are ready to go with teacher notes and student notes and really nicely presented. So feel free to go and have a look at those. And hopefully you'll be inspired in the future to create your own lessons based around your own culture, mythology, heritage, and legends. And if you want to find out more, you can email info@atcireland.ie. So if you want to join one of our teacher training courses this summer, you can send us an email here. You can also go to atclanguageschools.com and you'll see the full list of our teacher training courses. And you'll also see all the courses we have for junior students as well. But do keep connected with us because it's really good. We've made so many connections through these webinars. So it would be great if you kept connected with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. That was really wonderful. That was great.
Thank you.
I love that. It makes me want to go back and read all the old myths and legends again.
yeah, they're great.
Yeah, they're brilliant.
Pretty violent.
Yeah, they're pretty dark. You're right. They are pretty dark. All right. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions? We have some lovely comments there. Thank you very much. Any questions for Joanne? No,
No.
I don't think so.
Oh, here's one. Did something come in? No. Thank you very much for your comments. They're very nice. So if you think of any questions, if there's anything that comes up that you want to chat about, I will be on Facebook this Thursday at 1 p.m. Irish time. And I can answer any questions you have based on this webinar or any of the other webinars that we've held. So if you go to ATC Language Schools Facebook page at 1 p.m. this Thursday, I'll be there. It's just a 15-minute chat. And if you think of any questions, feel free to pop them in there. And then next week, Nadine is delivering the webinar on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Irish time and 2 p.m. Irish time. And Nadine is talking about helping students expand their vocabulary. And this is the second session. Nadine, can you give us a bit more detail on that?
That's right, Joanne. Yes, so I did the first session earlier on in this webinar series where I looked at teaching and learning collocation as a way to help learners expand their vocabularies. The session next week, Teaching and Learning Vocabulary Part 2, is on strategies. So helping our students develop learning strategies so that they can become independent learners of vocabulary, strategies that will help them discover the meaning of new words, and then importantly, strategies for consolidating those words and helping them create good memory traces of new words, new vocabulary.
Fantastic. That sounds brilliant. So if you want to come along to that, you can go to eltconnect.com and register for free there. And hopefully I'll see you on Facebook this Thursday. So thank you very much, Nadine.
Thank you, Joanne. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Hopefully we'll see you all again next week. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.